Welcome to this short presentation. At the end of their studies, many students have to write a master thesis, and many of them struggle a bit, especially at the start of the process of what should be in a master thesis, what are the components. So with this lecture, I would like to give a bit of a practical guide on what should be in, and I think it's important to stress that I'm an economist working at an economics faculty. So my focus will be a lot on writing a thesis in economics and business. It might be helpful for other disciplines as well, but I think that many things relate mostly to economics and business. As a bit of a disclaimer, I work at Utrecht University. However, this is my personal view on many things of what makes a good master thesis in economics. But I must say that what I will tell you is quite general, so some of the supervisors might disagree, but I guess that they will disagree on minor issues. But it's always wise to discuss these setups with your supervisor as well. But this is just to kick off some of these things. A second disclaimer, the slides are pretty dense. I do this on purpose, just to give also the presentation as some kind of a manual. It's not that I think that these are the best presenting slides. It's just to be a bit complete in what I think. So let me start, and let me start with one of the first questions. Is that there are always a few more broad questions if you start writing a master thesis, and a general question is how long should the master thesis be? And often the manuals are not precise about that. They're not saying 50 pages or 30 or that many words. Of course, in some universities they do. But I think that a good line of thinking is that ultimately in university we are interested in providing academic output. And this is a bit of a test whether you, as a master student, are able to complete what you could say more or less a finished academic article, or at least come close to it. So what I always recommend is to look at some journals that are leading in your field of economics and business and see how these articles look. And these articles are often between, let's say, 15 and 13 pages. Not less, but also not more, because then it makes it difficult for them to get them published in a journal. And I think in general your aim is to mirror such a paper. But there are reasons why I think that the typical master thesis is a bit longer and might be something closer to 50 pages. And there are a few reasons. Is that compared to the articles that you see, you might spend a bit more on related literature. So in a master thesis, your command of the field is important to show to the supervisors, and that is less the case in academic articles. So one thing that you should do a bit more in depth is the literature review. I think also that you should show that you master the process of generating a hypothesis, your research methods. So compared to a paper that is written for an audience that is quite accomplished in these research methods and probably also the related literature themselves, you might be a bit longer, more explanatory to show so that you understand what you're doing. And I think also the third reason that there are often limits in pages in good journals, so you try to economize on graphs and tables that might be relevant, and I'll come back to robustness checks, but don't make a professional publication. But for you, this can be very important to show these kind of things or these kind of extensions in an appendix. So then you run towards 50 to 60 pages or something like that. And again, this is not black and white, but mirror it, but a few things should be deeper. The second question is also often, you should write it yourself. But what does that mean? A lot of students are afraid that they're caught for plagiarism. Or at least that will lead to all kinds of understanding. Now, I would like to point out a few things. So first of all, there's a common misunderstanding, I might say, is that students might think that if they make references, then it's all okay. But that's not the case. So if you put in large chunks of text copying, more than 2 lines would say, even if you make a reference, that can be considered plagiarism. You shouldn't do it. So the other thing is that you say, well, okay, then I take a piece and rewrite those pieces of information in my own words. But that is also, if you do that for a long spell of text, that is also not good. It's more difficult to detect, obviously, but for yourself, that is also not the thing. I think the thing what you can say is if you make references or discuss literature or things like that, and you can combine the two. So you write it in your own words, but then also put a reference where you got these insights from. But in general, taking existing things and spending more than one paragraph per source would not be a good idea in all kinds of circumstances. Again, these are a bit of shortcuts to remembering what I mean. So that's two things. So how big, plagiarism and things like that, very general things. So let me go to my topic. My actual topic is what should be in the thesis, and I made a bit of a list as a standard setup. So you can use this as a very strict guide, and it helps you, and it may speed up your process. But of course, if you're ambitious, you put in your own things or you leave things out. But this is just to help to have the core right. And the next slides of this presentation will provide more details on each of those elements. So this is just a starting slide, and I think that I've put down these 8 quite general sections. So maybe you can see it as an article with sections, and you should start with the title page, and I'll come back to that what should be on it. But it's you think this is minor, but I think this is quite an important part of your thesis. Then your introduction, the related literature, and again I'll come back to this. A related literature section, often the second section in your paper, if you just don't put the title page as a section, can be also combined with a conceptual model or the formal creation of hypotheses. So often this kind of related literature, conceptual model, and hypothesis is one big chunk after the introduction. Then the third is that you introduce your data, your research model methods. In this presentation, I assume that most of the thesis projects will be an empirical project. So in economics, it might be that there's a formal mathematical model, or in business studies, more the conceptual kind of thing, descriptive things. I would say that these are quite different setups than what I'm discussing, but the bulk of the thesis will be to some extent empirical. So that would be my focus. Okay. So then there will be various sections of results, including robustness checks. So just your empirical results, and you discuss them. Then there's the conclusion, a reference list, and the appendix. And so next I will go over what should be, to my opinion, still stressing my opinion, be a key to each of those elements. So let me start with the title page. So the title page. So your title page should obviously on top have the title of your thesis. Now what are important components to consider is first that your title should capture your research question. So it should be basically clear from your title what is the topic, the question that you're researching. So it can be a question or your main result, but make sure that it immediately has a signal. So the second thing is you should see your title as some kind of a marketing slogan for your paper. So that thing. So you can have a working title in the beginning, but if your results come in and if you have your first discussions with your, don't be afraid to change the title over the course of the thesis to really signal what you have been doing. Then the second line maybe be your name, and after your name there's a footnote, and in this footnote you should provide your contact details and state who your supervisors are. And often, again, this is a bit like my personal preference. What I do not like in thesis is people in the introduction or saying something before the introduction start to thank their supervisors, their parents, etc., etc. I think that is not common in academia. So you might want to thank your supervisor, but don't spend too much on this, and keep it short. These kind of things, it should not be your marriage speech or something like that. So keep this short. Then on the title page, very important part should be an abstract. An abstract of your research questions, main findings, and aim for some 150 words. Often this is very difficult to write. It's often too long. So look in other papers how they do it. It's not easy. It should capture the main content and the conclusion of your thesis. Then below that, it is wise to provide, let's say, 3 keywords. So if your paper about centralization, development policies, things like that. So to try to come up with 3 keywords or sets of keywords, what your thesis is about. And you can also, in economics, state the Journal of Economic Literature codes. That is not necessary. It is a bit posh if you're a student that you say, oh, I know exactly how it works. But for professional publications, if you have to submit to journals, they would scan the fields where the thesis is located through the Journal of Economic Literature codes. So it's fun. You can find it. You can Google the YEL codes and you'll find it, and it gives a professional twist to a title page. Then, no university logo. The thing is that if you put on logos, then you're signaling that the institution of where the logo is from is responsible, or in some way has cleared the message of what you're saying. This, I think, in general is not the case for a thesis. So you're not. So I think as a student you should leave this as a blank page and not. In general, by the way, in academic articles you rarely see colors, pictures, and things like that. So I would simply do it like this and don't put some kind of a picture on it, like some shipping or whatever. Just keep it plain, I would say. My last point in this is be aware that maybe not for your thesis, but for a lot of people, maybe 90% of the people don't look beyond the title page. And what they see, the abstract, they see the title and they get 80% of the information, and maybe they decide I know enough. And this is a good thing. If you're a professional economist like me, you have to keep up with many papers a day, actually. So the better the abstract is written from, I think if it's not really the spot of what I'm researching, I'm very happy with people who provide me good information on the title page. So it's not that I'm not interested in it, but it can be a subject that is that I like, but I get the main message quickly. So pay attention to this. It has an important function. That's your title page. Clearly, after the title page, we move to the introduction. So how to write an introduction, and I've put up, let's say, a structure of paragraphs, of which I think is always very helpful. Not only very helpful, but I think that many people read an introduction of an academic work anticipating that it will have a certain structure. So if you follow a bit of that structure, it's also easier for people to read because it relates to what they are expecting. So, yeah, of course, you might like to be, let's say, unique or things like that, but not so much in how you build it up. You'd like to be unique in what you're researching, and but not so much in that you are a brilliant original writer. So a first paragraph of a paper, or a thesis, should be what I would call looking out of the window. So the bigger picture, so the real world perspective. By the way, there are some notes below some of the slides that you might find helpful, where I dig into a few more details on it. But it is something like you try to convince that the things that you're studying is an issue in the real world. You don't start with the academic thing. So why it is in academia. So start with, I would say, with the real world. Of course, this is also a preference. How to do that? So in this first paragraph, you can look at policy, papers. You can look at some things that business people have said, maybe even a news article, things like that, just to make sure that we start off with the fact that it is an issue in real world. Then in the second and maybe the third question, you try to relate this kind of general observation to what you could call the problem definition in the research question. This is 1 or 2 paragraphs where you would say, well, okay, this is, let's say, the popular kind of situation or the real world perspective. But look, there's also in academia, in the literature, a lot of interest for this issue because this person, that person, etc. has worked on it. So, but then you often start to signal in the second and third paragraph that there is some kind of a gap in the literature. So you're already signaling, okay, they've done this, but actually what they left out is this. So these paragraphs should enter with some kind of a call to action, and that would be your research question. So why are you doing it? Because actually you put another piece of the puzzle that others have not gone after for the moment. So you try to actually generate this call to action as a research question in these paragraphs. Then the third part would be, well, I would always say in this thesis, to start actually that within this thesis, which is 1 paragraph, and it's very close to your abstract probably, where you would say everything that you're going to do. We're studying this, we use that method, these are our main results, etc. So that is, let's say, the core message. Often people scan the introduction for this kind of thing if they have not got a sufficient answer in the abstract already. Then after what you're doing and how you're doing it, you often have a few contributions to what are your contributions to research?
Ik weet niet waar je bent.
And so that's something where you should signal, oh, they've done this and I do that. For policy making, could also be policy. We need to have more answers, so we inform this. So really the relevance of the thesis can come after what you're doing. Be aware that later on you have to do the related literature section. So this is also already a bit of a warm-up where you would say we have this piece of literature, that piece of literature, and I add to that by doing this. So it is already shaping what you'll do in more detail in the related literature section later. So keep those relationships in mind of the full thesis. And then end, I would say, with a paragraph which says the setup of the paper or the thesis is like this. I think that if you write a piece of 30 to 50 pages, you don't need to include a separate table of content. I see a lot of students doing that. Can be, if it's a bit longer, to guide through, but often you'll see that there's a paragraph where you actually explain what the different sections are. It can be quite helpful. So you can say, look, in section 2 below we discuss the related literature, make the conceptual model, and then after that we introduce it, so that you do a bit like words. So in words and sentences, you make a table of contents. So these are the parts that you would see in an introduction. So let me move on to the related literature section, conceptual framework and hypotheses. So first I think that you have to think in the process of writing the thesis, which of those 3 elements will be there, because they really shape how you do the other things. Let me make this clear. It's a bit more theoretical, but I think in research it's often about causal relations. If A goes up, then B happens. If firms start to internationalize, they also become more innovative, or is it the other way around? So there often you're after some kind of a causality. So what you probably need for that is some kind of a conceptual model of where certain causalities come from. If this goes up, then that goes up, but it is moderated by that. So you can think of, okay, so behind my research question and research strategy is some kind of conceptual model which describes the causalities. And hypotheses that you're actually testing using empirical research are the direct translations of the things that you see in a conceptual model. Why is this important? Because point 3 is that often you set up some kind of a conceptual framework for empirics using existing literature. So if you have hypotheses, they should come from the related literature already, and the conceptual model as well. Maybe there are gaps in the literature, but at least the framework and where you try to add comes from the related literature. So it may help to have a bit of conceptual model in mind, because a conceptual model creates hypothesis, but it also organizes the way in which you organize the related literature. So let's say if there are 3 things that determine something, you introduce where these 3 things come from the literature. And therefore they also relate then to your hypothesis. So in that way, you actually integrate these things well. So my 4th thing is, of course, if you don't make a formal conceptual model or not formal hypothesis, although of course you have a research question, but not a hypothesis like hypothesis 1, and then make sure that your related literature is actually firmly connected to your empirics and the research question. So it must be really, with every reference that you put into a related literature, there should be a clear connection to why that reference is important for what you're doing. So if you introduce related to why that is important for your research. Again, this is difficult or a complex thing of writing this well. I think that for professional academics, this often takes a lot of time to get this right. You have the conceptual one, but writing it down so that it's actually clear, it's often quite difficult. Then we move on to section 3, data and method. So I think that in this section you should start by introducing your main data sources. And I think that in the first paragraph or 2 paragraphs, there's often connection between if you use the World Development Indicators, how you come from the World Development Indicators to the actual database that you have created. So often there are a few steps of selection of variables and things like that. So that is what you start off. Now, the second paragraph often is that you go after some stylized facts using the database that you have built. Stylized facts are often basic correlations that already tell you something about your hypothesis. So you have some variables in mind that you created in the data set, you have some correlations, and you might even go for a graphical kind of exposition. What I do not like, and see the note, is that people go to Stata, the most used empirical, and just press on standard statistics, and you get the means and the medians and the variance and the minimum, and that is often not very informative. What we're after is the data set actually able to provide descriptive statistics, also already a bit analytical, that already tells something about the hypothesis. Then the third thing is that you're working towards an empirical model, so you might introduce specific variables that you're going to use in the econometrics things. I'd like to give you a bit of a tip here. Many of you will use the Stata program. Now spend a bit of time of finding out what labels are. So you have the variables in Stata and you can label them. And often these variables have awkward names like xz3_z. So if you're introducing these variables like this means that is not nice. What is very easy is that in Stata you can run with these variables the regression, but then tell Stata with the label command that in tables it should show the labels. And you can write everything in these labels like growth, employment, inequality, and that makes it much easier to introduce the variables here. So it is very difficult to say, well, we are after equality, which is the variable x3z. If the variable is called inequality, that you can explain what it is, what it measures. So that is a bit like how you can do it. So spend a bit of time in seeing how this labeling works. Often important tip. After that, you explain your empirical methods, or you're doing regressions, panel analysis, etc. And I think it's important that you convince the reader, therefore your supervisor, that this method is sufficient and efficient and sufficient to answer the research question. Difficult is not that easy to explain why for that research question you need that empirical strategy. And that's the key thing to transmit here. And lastly, in empirical papers, often helpful to start to formally state the regression in mathematics, to have, let's say, the regression in it. With a very simple regression, it might be overkill, but as soon as it becomes a bit more complicated, like dynamic panel, etc., it can be very informative to see whether we agree with the specification, with fixed effects, with randomizing and dummies and things like that. So that can be very helpful to actually do this in a formal way. Okay. Then we go to results sections. So that can be one section, it can be more, but I focus, let's say, if in a section. So you present your main results, often in tables. It's always important, but probably obvious, is that there's also a piece of text. So you explain what we see in the paper. So there should always be a connection between the text and the tables. You don't put tables in or without referring to them. I think that if you talk about tables, there are few rules. Often vertical lines are not nice. So you have only a vertical line after, let's say, the thing, but the rest should be blank in that sense. Always put in the number of observations, use footnotes, and in the PowerPoint presentation I've given a few more tips on what should be in these tables. I will also make some extra tutorial on how to produce these nice tables using Stata, so that you don't put, so that really informs about what you can put into these tables and how. So be sure that when you discuss the results, you have to relate back to your hypothesis and the research questions. If you have formal hypothesis and research question in your thesis, so be sure that you connect it, everything we see, to your research question, as so that we can see the dynamics of how you answer the research question, so that we don't have to wait for the conclusion for you to conclude on this. That should be, let's say, a process. Don't describe, therefore, that much what we actually already see in the table. So don't say too much like the coefficient of inequality is 5. We can also already see in the table. Focus a lot on what you conclude from the analysis in this part. Then the fourth thing is that you have a baseline regression table with your main results. And in research, what you try to do is to kick those results so much until with that kicking, they still stand. So that is a bit like a strategy. So robustness checks is that you say, well, yeah, but if I include or exclude this variable, does the effect disappear? Or if I use this subset, does it disappear? So you can do a few robustness checks with different specifications to see how robust the results are. You can make them subsections, could be, but at least that is a good strategy of having a baseline results, different specifications, and to see how robust the results are. And then I think that it's wise to end such a session with, let's say, an overall discussion, where you relate what all we have seen in relation to your hypothesis. Okay, so that is, let's say, a results section. Okay. In the conclusions, the more standard setup of a conclusion section is that you start by restating your main findings, your research questions. Again, this is quite close to the abstract, but maybe in the past tense, what you have found. Then after that, it is clever to spend a bit of time on what you could call caveats in your results. So there are often a few things that you're not able to do. Maybe your data set is specific, or there is some kind of an endogeneity that you've not been able to flesh out, or these kind of things. So you might come up with, your data are imperfect because they come from sources that can only do so much. So already anticipate a bit of a criticism on your thesis, and you can say, well, okay, we try to deal with that as good as possible, but show that you're aware of some limitations of that. That can be a nice part of the conclusions. Then, thirdly, you spend a paragraph why your results are important from an academic perspective. Again, you might already have said a few things about that in the introduction, but you might go a bit more, I would say, over the top. But why it is important that we have read and that we have done this. The fourth one, often not so much, is that you step out of, let's say, the academic world, and you think about how can we use the analysis of the thesis, and why would it be informative for better policy, or if you're more in the business domain, for managerial decision making. So not so much only academically, what can actually the real world do it? So you actually return to your first paragraph of looking out of the window. And then you may end, not easy if you are a student, but you can give it a go with if you would have another half year or a year, what would you start researching? So what kind of new questions did your research bring up with you, and that you can go after? So these 5 elements might be helpful for writing your conclusions. So moving to my last slides, references. So I think that most of the standards use standard, let's say, referencing style. So the reference list is not really the problem, that is closely, let's say, defined. But often more difficult is how you actually make references in the text. So the first thing is try to be as consistent in the way you reference as possible. But it's often not 100% possible, but try to be as consistent as possible. But there are 2 kinds of, let's say, referencing strategies. And the first is that with using a reference, you first put, let's say, the reference itself. So there are 2 ways of doing that. So first is that you put the authors first. So Boermans and Roelfsema 2018 argue that innovation follows internationalization. This is a kind of referencing style which you see often in economics. So you put the reference first. Another way of doing it in writing is writing your own line and then making the reference where it comes from. So innovation often follows internationalization, Boermans and Roelfsema 2018. So this style is more common in business and policy-oriented studies. So you tell your own story and then you relate to others that have said this. But make a choice, basically, and stick to that. Again, you cannot be 100% doing that often. So if you have the second style, like in the end, if it's a really important paper, you might introduce it using the first. But just keep it in mind. The third thing is something about the appendix. So in appendix, you should put things that would distract from the natural flow of reading. So, for example, the exact measurement of variables would take a lot of main text. So you can do that. You can say in the main text, always refer to an appendix. This is done in the appendix. And then, for example, some of the robustness results are maybe too detailed. You can refer to them in the appendix or appendix 1, 2. I do this. So always refer in the main text to specific components. Lastly, what I personally like in a thesis, and in the modern world, we get a lot of sources from the internet. Many data sources also from the internet. So you can make some kind of a database references. And that avoids that in the main text you have all these ugly HTML links included. And by the way, if you download material from the internet, try to reference to, let's say, the documents that you have downloaded. For instance, so in general, try to use the reference of the report itself and not just use the web link. So I hope this is helpful. It is slightly more than half an hour. I hope you follow my guidance, but clearly you would put also in consultation with your actual supervisor some of the nuances differently.